common problems is the compulsion students feel to find the one right answer. Or worse yet, they rush to closure, reporting back as self-evident truths the facts or conclusions presented in the text or document. Now think about that for a minute. What would our founders say to this? You know, those are the guys who talked about self-evident truth. This is the worst problem a child could have, reporting back as self-evident truths. You see, the principles of the Declaration of Independence stand in the way of this entire agenda, so it must be eradicated. You know those 7 principles of the Declaration, don't you, all by heart? National sovereignty, natural law, self-evident truth. All men are created equal. By the way, he didn't mean the gender, he meant mankind, both male and female. Creator-given unalienable rights that included life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness or property. Government's purpose to secure these rights. And finally, popular sovereignty, the consent of the governed.
These are the principles that stand in the way of sustainable development.
So this is the big debate in Minnesota right now. Because of the 30,000 strong Maple River Education Coalition, we have now repealed, been the only state to repeal the Goals 2000 curriculum. The debate now shifts to the replacement principles. We managed to get all of the Declaration principles in the House version passed, failed in the Senate. When it came out of conference committee, they were gone. When the chairman of the Joint Committee was asked why they weren't there, here was his response. The Declaration has no legal status in defining people's rights. None whatsoever. He repeated that on the floor of the Senate, by the way. But see, I'm a collector of rare founding era books. This is an original John Quincy Adams explaining the connection between these two great documents. John Quincy Adams put it this way. He said that the virtues which had been infused into the Constitution of the United States was no other than the concretion of those abstract principles which had been first proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence, namely the self-evident truths of the natural and unalienable rights of man, and the dissolvent sovereignty of the people, always subordinate to a rule of right and wrong and always responsible to the supreme ruler of the universe for the rightful exercise of that sovereign power. He went on to say, this was the platform upon which the Constitution of the United States has been erected. Its virtues, its republican character consisted in its conformity to the principles proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence. Folks, we celebrate the birthday of this nation on July 4th, not August 7th. That's because the Constitution was the working papers that put in place the principles contained in the Declaration. This document was written only in order to form a more perfect union. Without the Declaration, it's meaningless, or can be made to mean whatever you want it to mean. And that's what they're doing through the education system. They are shaping our thinking by doctoring up the Declaration principles. This is a 4th grade book that explains a critical thinking question. By the way, what does critical thinking mean if there is no self-evident truth? We assume it means learning to discern the truth. But if self-evident truth doesn't exist, it becomes a tool for shaping thought. And here's an example. Well, this is the teacher's guide that tells us that this section describes it as thinking that is focused on deciding what to believe and what to do. Now, that's with a predetermined outcome. Here's some of the examples. I'm only going to do one. That's all I've got time for. Ask students to think of a law they would like to see passed. Suggest the environment, endangered species, education, those things that are important to sustainable development. Here's a teacher's assignment. Divide students into 2 or 3 groups. Have each group work together to produce a Bill of Rights for animals. Tell them to begin by discussing the ways in which they feel animals are sometimes treated unfairly. Folks, this is the lesson during the study of the Bill of Rights. This is what the kids are doing in their classrooms. Mainstream, this is Houghton Mifflin. It's not some obscure little textbook company. Well, without the Declaration principles, you can redefine, well, you redefine the Declaration principles if they're mentioned at all. This one says when Jefferson wrote that all men were equal, he really meant all citizens. Women and blacks were not included. This is a politicized version of the meaning using 20th century definitions for 18th century words. It's a very common tactic used by the publishers. Without the Declaration, what is the philosophy of our government? Well, according to the textbook, Enlightenment thinkers in the American colonies were excited. Here they were, the first people in history to have a chance to create an entirely new government based on Enlightenment principles. That, by the way, was the principles that founded the failed French Revolution. It is not the foundation principles of our document. Well, what evidence do they give you? They tell you that a study was done of 15,000 political writings published in America, and a tally was taken, and they found out that the most quoted source was French philosopher Baron de Montesquieu, then David Hume and John Locke. The problem was I knew this was wrong, so I got the original study published in this book, and they actually show that Blackstone was number 2 at 7.9%. Now, why did they censor out Blackstone? Well, because Blackstone is the author of the commentaries on the laws of England, and he was the one who gave us the phrase, the laws of nature in nature's God, contained in the Declaration. He defined the law of nature this way: this will of his maker is called the law of nature. This law of nature, dictated by God himself, is of course superior in obligation to any other. It is binding over all the globe and all countries and at all times. No human laws are of any validity if contrary to this. Of course, we have to censor that, don't we? Because this is a violation, obviously, of separation of church and state, which, you know, doesn't show up in our Constitution. It is in Article 58 of the ex-Soviet Constitution. The study goes on to tell us, though, that the Bible was quoted 34% of the time, more than 4 times Montesquieu. That was just censored out, and the assumption then was left with, well, we must be based on the Enlightenment. The study went on to say, although the citations came from virtually every part of the Bible, St. Paul was the favorite in the New Testament, especially the parts of his epistle to the Romans in which he discusses the basis for and limits on obedience to political authorities. Folks, this is what justified the revolution. It was based on natural law, a higher truth than man. Whether you believed it or not, this was good for all societies. This did not mean that you had to believe what they believed. This is just what we were based on. To teach this in public school isn't establishing a church. It's simply history lessons. To leave it out is nothing short of censorship. And I cover a lot of this kind of documentation in my video, America's Censored Heritage. I'm not going to go through much more of that. Let's move on. Without the Declaration principles, the Constitution can be made to say whatever you want it to say, and that's the way they're teaching it to our children. Did you know you could change the Constitution without amending it? How many knew that? Well, that's what the lesson teaches. This is the gospel truth to children in 8th grade. Most popular textbook in America, by the way, up until 1994 when it was replaced by the better stuff. The Constitution is not a rigid document. Because of imprecise language in some sections, it's open to interpretations. Most historians, have you noticed it's always most historians? And you can't find one, but most historians feel that this is more of a strength than a weakness. It moves on to say, by unofficial change method is meant first the Supreme Court's interpretation, which differs sometimes from court to court depending on new justices. Now, this makes perfect sense. I mean, if 2 + 2 is 4 only by consensus, well, certainly the meaning of the Constitution is going to be by consensus. Postmodern activist Justice Breyer told us that the men who wrote the Constitution left many important areas open to interpretation. Breyer said in a speech Monday at New York University, did he learn his lessons in school well? He must have been paying attention in class that day in 8th grade. The philosophy of the schoolroom in one generation will become the philosophy of government in the next. This is what they all believe today. He went on to explain that judges should be wary of enforcing a strict reading of the Constitution. Well, we don't want to go to what the founders actually meant. We want to interpret it for ourselves based on what society needs today. He went on to say those more literalist judges who emphasize language, history, tradition, and precedent cannot justify their practices by claiming that is what the framers wanted. Notice, by the way, it's always framers, no longer founders. because foundation suggests something that doesn't change very easy. You can always remodel your house and build a new frame. The framers didn't